Okay, we're going to take a look at creating costs, maintaining costs. But before we go into the actual entry of costs, let's take a look at what we mean by costs and where they're stored. So in the tools master table maintenance, we're going to go into the system tables. This is really only accessible by the system administrator. And we're going to go into cost type codes. This is where our costs are going to be maintained. There's a listing of all our costs in here, and for each one we have a cost type code. That's whatever we call the cost internally in VISCO. Whether or not it's inventoriable. And what we mean by that is, should we include costs that are entered with this cost type in anytime we're projecting our latest projected costs or our landed costs? Do we want to include this cost type? So for the most part, you're going to say yes here, because if you didn't want to, then you probably wouldn't be entering them in VISCO. You'd be entering them directly into your accounting system. The accrual procedure and reverse accrual procedure are going to be maintained here at VISCO. When we add custom accruals for you, then we'll enter the code in there. Default distribution method means when we enter a cost of this type for a container, for example, or for an invoice, how do we by default want to distribute this cost across all ventures in that container or in that invoice? And let me explain what I mean by that by giving an example. Let's say we receive a freight bill from a freight forwarder, and it's a charge for ocean freight, and we're going to apply that cost to all ventures within a particular container. Well, there's a couple different ways in which we might want to apply that cost. Let's say the cost is $1,000. Do we want to distribute that cost by weight, or do we want to distribute it by quantity, or by value, or by volume? So how do we say which venture gets more of the cost, which venture gets less? And that's where you're going to define your default distribution method, and that's going to be a drop-down list. Comments are just comments that you can store internally about the cost type. And this is probably the most critical point about creating costs and maintaining costs, and that is the general ledger account code in which we should be posting to. And that has to match word for word, including capitalization, or letter for letter, or number for number, including capitalization, to exactly the general ledger code in the accounting system. Description is just a description of it, that whether or not it requires a quantity, a material quantity. Most costs are not going to require quantity, but in case of, say, material costs, for example, if we're not paying the entire bill, we want to say what portion of it we are paying, or what portion of that quantity is actually going to be applied. And whether or not we want to include this price, whether or not we want to include this cost in the price estimator tool, which is found in the offers section. So that's maintaining cost types. Once you've got the cost types in there, and that's really the first thing you need to do. But once you've got them in there, then you're going to go into the finances section, and we'll do cost entry. So for the moment, let's pretend that we've received a bill or several bills. But let's pretend for the moment it's one bill from a supplier, and we're going to start entering that bill here in VISCO. The way we do that is we click Add Voucher. It's going to default to today as my entry date. This voucher number is going to be generated automatically. And we're going to select the vendor from our list of vendors here. Let's pretend for the moment it's a trucking company. Let's say Arrow Trucking. I'm going to enter that vendor's invoice number. Just going to enter something there. And the amount, total amount for that cost. Say $1,000, and we'll say edit costs. Now, the next thing it's going to ask me is what type of cost is it? And these are the cost types that we were just looking at in the system tables, the different cost types that we're maintaining here. And let's say for the moment that it's an inbound freight bill for $1,000, and now we have the option to apply the cost either to an entire container, to an entire invoice. By invoice we mean invoice out to the customer, or by a venture. So in the case of an inbound freight bill, most likely we want to apply that cost to an entire container. But if it was, for example, a outbound freight bill, or a trucking fee from the warehouse to the customer, then instead of applying it to a container, which would mean the inbound container, we would apply it to the invoice, which would reference that entire shipment to the customer. And if it's another type of bill, we want to just apply it to a specific venture, then we would select venture. I'm going to select container for the moment and say, let's define which container we're referring to. This brings up a listing of all containers in the system. I'm going to pick one with multiple ventures for the purposes of demonstration. I'll select this one. And this lists the two different ventures that were in this particular container. And now here's my opportunity to indicate how I want to distribute this cost across the ventures in this container. So we've got it by accrual, which would mean based on the, if we have an accrual for inbound freight, just apply the cost based on the accrual that we have set up, or by ratio, depending on how the accrual works, by quantity, by weight, equally across both ventures, or open distribution or open percentage, meaning I'll define the percentage I want to split between each venture, or I'll define the amount I want to split between each venture. For the moment, let's say we want to do it by quantity. And once we select our distribution method, we're going to click the Recalculate button. And it automatically recalculates both the percentage and the amount that it's going to apply to each venture. So in this case, we had a much larger venture here. So it applied $904 of the total 1,000 to this venture and only $95 to this one. I'll say I'm done. By the way, if at this point I had an accrual in there and this amount was more than my accrual, it would have delivered a warning to me there saying that you're paying more than you anticipated to pay, and I could manually select from the checkboxes whether or not I wanted to accept overpayment for that particular cost. So once the cost is entered, by the way, you could have entered multiple costs there in that batch, but once you've entered the costs, then they sit here with this pending status until someone chooses to post them to the accounting system, at which point it will send that entire batch down to the accounting system where those costs then appear as as payables in the accounting system. So from here on out, in terms of check writing and aging of the payables, that's all going to be handled out of the accounting system once it's posted.